Welcome on board the Rich Planet Starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. I'm Richard D. Hall. In the summer of 2009, I travelled to Torquay to meet and interview researcher Roy Dutton. Over the last 40 years, Roy has developed the Astronautical Theory of strange aerial craft. He contends that non-human spacecraft are periodically using a number of very specific orbital paths very high above the Earth as they approach our planet. He believes that these are motherships which send out smaller surveillance-type craft down to the Earth, which account for UFO cases worldwide. By analysing the times and locations of UFO sightings over many years, using his knowledge of space aeronautics, he has specified the orbital paths he believes the motherships are using. We're here in Torquay with Roy Dutton, and we're going to talk about his astronautical theory, which basically describes delivery paths of UFOs. I'm going to ask Roy about his background. What was your path through your education and your work career, which kind of brought you to learning about astronautical paths and that kind of thing, Roy?
Well, I began in the mid-1950s as a 5-year engineering apprentice, professional engineering apprentice with Avro A.V. Rowan Company in Manchester. And this led me through a whole series of activities, which began with workshop experience, and then with the design and development experiences later. And what was going on at that time was that they were producing the Vulcan bomber, V-bomber for the Air Force, and also the Shackleton research craft, or maritime reconnaissance craft, I should say, and the weapons division, Avro Weapons Division, was producing the blue steel standoff bomb, as they called it, which was a rocket-powered cruise missile, supersonic missile. It was, and which was designed to fly at about 2.5 Mach number.
And what year are we talking about, Roy?
We're talking, I joined the company at the end of 1954. So all these 5 years were spent in the 50s, basically.
Okay.
And then at the end of that, I finished my training in the Weapons Research Division and eventually in the Special Projects Office of the Weapons Research Division, which is where my career as such began.
Okay. And you presumably gained quite a bit of knowledge of the dynamics of aircraft, and did you have any knowledge at that time of how orbits work, how satellites work that are in orbit around the Earth, or was that something that you've educated yourself on?
No, that was part of my crash course, you might say, in the Special Projects Department, the Weapons Research Division, right. Because the head of that department, John E. Allen, was a very strong advocate for a British space launcher program, and he encouraged my interest in that, and gave me opportunities to develop my skills in that, and my knowledge.
So that gave you a grounding in the sort of science behind how things stay in orbit and what the mathematics are behind different types of orbit and that kind of thing.
Yes, in fact, I was engaged with others in space feasibility studies. So not only what was required to put things into orbit, but also what was required for spacecraft, what kind of equipment, etc., was required. So I had a very good grounding in normal astronautics as it was developing at the time, very early time, in the early days of the space race, basically.
And what about, we will come on to this again later, but I want to ask you now whether you had learned about things which approach the Earth and then want to park in a particular orbit. Would that have been covered in that type of education?
Not generally, except in terms of things returning from a journey out in space, that's to the moon and back, and to see how they would cope with re-entry and that sort of thing. Avro Company has taken over or became part of Hawker-Siddeley, this Hawker-Siddeley group, and it was split again into the dynamics division and the aircraft division.
So are you saying that within the research departments of that company at that time, they were looking into potential space paths and space vehicles then?
Into future space, we were looking at the possibilities of Britain having its own space program at some future date, and the kind of enhancements that have to be made before we could afford it.
So you were gearing up your knowledge in order to potentially work on a space vehicle that may have been developed by that particular company. Is that?
Yes, that was there's a special projects department. We were given the task to look into possibilities of that kind, and to keep up to date with what was going on.
And if we move on from your work background, you coined the term SAC. Now, can you tell us what that stands for and what it actually means?
Oh, well, the things I began to investigate, first of all, that background made me interested in the reports that were being given in the Greater Manchester area, of things that were flying low over the housetops without any noise and glowing in the dark and all that sort of thing, frightening people to death, basically. So I thought I'd look into them. And I call them strange aerial craft, because they did sound like craft, not just lights in the sky.
You postulate the different type of shapes that people who have managed to get close enough to these strange aerial craft have reported, and we all know that they're very often disc-shaped. But you hypothesized that if one of these discs was to, it's generally agreed within the UFO community that they have some kind of propulsion system, and it may be anti-gravity, it may be not, but it's a means of stopping off the ground and propelling itself. I believe that you hypothesized that what would happen if that craft suddenly switched off its propulsion system. It would need to cope with whatever conditions were created after it had switched that off, and you did a little bit of investigation into that, didn't you? Could you tell us about that?
Well, the reason for that was that some people had described disc dome things, as I call them, disc with domes on top, that was seen to oscillate down from the sky, and also perhaps spiral down. Right. And I thought, I don't know whether that would be the case for these things. They looked so as if they'd flip over or something like that. Right. So I decided I would make a model of one of them, but I had no model, as it were, nothing to design it from, except Leonard Cramp's analysis of the Adamski craft, which was a disc dome kind of construction. So I built a scale model of that, only 6 inches in diameter, and I tried to figure out how the weight distribution might be have been created, and to check out the oscillation rate and so on beforehand. Then I tried dropping that model from a great height, the highest step ladder I can find, basically, and watched what happened. And I discovered that, sure enough, it oscillated down like that very nicely, quite rapidly, quite quickly. And if I put a bit of spin on it, it would then spiral down.
Okay, so it wouldn't flip over.
I timed those drops, and I worked out what the mean rate of fall was, and then scaled that up to what I thought might be the full scale, which was again a guideline from Adamski, which said it was 35 feet in diameter. So I scaled up the effect from the small model to that scale, and I found that the rates of descent were very similar to those described by the eyewitnesses. So it seemed to me that one explanation for this oscillating behavior was in fact an aerodynamic effect of the thing dropping, losing height by either of those two methods. You see.
But so it was in free fall, but undergoing air resistance as it fell.
Yes, and with the air breaking up, breaking off it.
Okay, and then you then started doing analysis of lots of different reports of these strange aerial craft, and I believe that you did some analysis on sightings from 1967 on a map.
Well, that's where it all started, in 1967. That's where all these, in the late summer of 1967, that's when all these sightings started to occur.
Right.
And so it started from there. And in addition to analysing the things that were being described, and the colours and the changes of colour and all that sort of thing, as the thing changed its attitude, I also checked where the things were concentrating on, where they seemed to be concentrated, and looked at the areas where these occurred, and also the kind of things of interest, perhaps human interest, that could be associated with them.
So you plotted a map of the UK where you had a point for every sighting of a similar characteristic, and what did you find from that 1967 map?
Well, I found very surprising sort of results, because I expected there might have been, if they were coming from outer space and they were actually investigating our development here, that they might be interested in our technology.
Yeah.
So I was looking at things like transmitting stations and railway airports and that sort of thing, and also reservoirs. But as a last minute sort of thought, and the reason for this was, I'll tell you about shortly, I added historical sites, marked historical sites that were on the map, ordnance survey maps. And the reason for that actually was because the first analysis I did of the distribution of these events in northern England mostly, well, down to the was that one of the centre line of that very narrow band of only 35 miles wide actually went through Stonehenge.
Right.
Also, if I put a path, rather a band, twice that width across the southern county, southern county's sightings, and put a centre line through that too went across the other line at Stonehenge. And I thought, well, that could be just a fluke, Yeah. It wasn't something I took very seriously, but I added to the list of the things I was looking for when I did the other analysis.
Okay. So you compared all of these different locations with locations of motorways, of ancient sites, and nuclear, perhaps military bases or something like that. All different things.
Yes.
And what did you find was the most common thing where UFOs were being seen next to them?
Well, the amazing thing was that 77% of all the sites had ancient connections.
Right. Okay.
And there were, other quite high proportions in the other areas too, but that was the highest, and that really stunned me. Although the trouble was, it wasn't a proper statistical analysis because I didn't look at the relative abundance of all these various things, on the Earth, on the countryside, I should say. So.
And there was another map, similar map in 1971. Am I right in thinking that?
That's right. I did it again in 1971 because another spate of sightings at that time.
And how did that compare
and
to 1967?
And that came out very similar to the first one in the northwest area. But it was skewed more to the northwest. So it didn't go. That line didn't go through Stonehenge. I mean, it's a different pattern, but very similar.
And they were described as fireballs between that time, 67 to 71.
There were quite a number of fireballs seen at that time in that period.
So these fireballs that you're plotting on these maps, how would you answer a skeptic who might say that, well, they're obviously meteors that have been spotted here?
No, these were not meteors. I mean, I know the difference between a meteor and one of these things, and a fireball. I thought they were more like plasma balls of plasma, glowing plasma. They could be very slow moving, very bright, and yet they didn't seem to be leaving any trail behind them. They could move very quickly sometimes. They maneuvered sometimes. And I thought, well, this sounds as if they could be it sounds as if these could be being artificially controlled.
Right. Okay.
So
some kind of intelligence behind their...
So I took them in account of them, though I didn't count them as strange aerial craft, basically. Right. I mean, they were something else.